Okay, I didn't quite get through the whole day yet. I'm like an hour behind. Um, but I've listened to almost an entire additional day of the cross-examination of Alexander Murdaugh. And I have to say, it is truly remarkable. I think that the cross-examination, if anything, helped his case. It certainly didn't help the prosecution. The prosecutor got up a guy who should be played by Richard Dreyfuss in the movie. Well, I know there's going to be a movie made about this trial. They'll just have to deep fake Richard Dreyfuss, make him look how he looked about like 1995, and that would be perfect. And so you have this pudgy little, mid-50s bald manlet walking around yapping, just basically taking stabs in the dark at Murdaugh. Because apparently the prosecution, as I have said repeatedly, as anyone who's been watching this trial knows, seems to have nothing on Alexander Murdaugh, actually tying him to the murders. But today was at least a little more interesting because we got a little closer to actually talking about the murders themselves and the day of the murders, the events surrounding the murder of his son and his wife. We got to see video recordings of the interview that the police did with Murdaugh on the night of the murders. And for a while, it looked like it was Murdaugh himself who was cross-examining the prosecutor. It was remarkable. Murdaugh was, requesting, articles from of evidence. He was requesting certain pieces of evidence be brought up, and then he was telling him, okay, go through the video here, pause here, and then he was explaining things. And he took charge for quite a while. Now, I do think that the prosecutor was able to win back some of the control over the situation later in the day, but that was more just because, Murdaugh was just sitting there. He wasn't trying to take charge. They were actually, I was watching Good Logic's channel. You guys should all sub to him. They were pointing out, Joe and whoever else happened to be on the stream at the moment, were pointing out there were chances that Murdaugh had, that he could have gone harder against the prosecutor. He could have, jumped in and taken charge and, changed the subject. And the prosecutor really was, not doing a good job of asserting control. He was asking these open-ended questions, time after time. He would just say something, and then he'd say, you care to comment, Mr. Murdaugh? And he said, comment on what? What's the question? And he's like, well, what do you think? He's like, I don't think anything. That's not what you're supposed to do. I mean, cross-examination, in the few trials I've seen, I'm no lawyer, but, normally you want to ask questions that are bad for that. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Bad for the defendant or bad for whoever's on the stand. Or in this case, when you have a defendant testifying in a murder trial like this, you want to ask every question in a way that no matter how he answers, it makes him look bad. And Richard Dreyfuss was just not doing that. And all he did was he kept bringing up, oh, you lied to people, right? You stole money, didn't you? And it's like, well, yeah, I've admitted all that. It's like, oh. And, the implication is supposed to be, well, he lied about stealing money, so I guess, you're probably lying about killing your family too, aren't you? And, the more I watch, the more I'm assured that this guy is not guilty, because the state keeps pounding on this. It's all his credibility. That's all they're attacking. They're not actually going after evidence, trying to tie him to the murders. They're saying, hey, well, you were actually here, before. There was a Snapchat video that shows, hey, you were here at the site of the murders, before they were dead. And I guess for until recently, Murdaugh had not admitted that. He had said that he was never there. But, it's a difference of about 300 yards. He said, well, I was in the house. Well, the house is 300 yards away. This is a barn that's on the same property. And so it's not nothing that he lied about that. But it's all they have. that's it. That and just saying, well, he's a dishonest person. It's like, okay, well, how do you explain how he killed him? Why did he kill him? Where are the murder weapons? Why was there no evidence on his clothes recovered that showed that he had fired a gun recently? And so most of the time, this is the most substantive stuff out of the day that I'm going over now. I mean, most of the time he's just asking him total nonsense, like, how many pills did you take on any given day? And Murdaugh would say, well, it depends on the day. He said, okay, well, what about on this day? And he said, well, I guess it depends on, the potency of the pills. The pills come in different milligrams or whatever, and he was, blah, 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 going over stuff, telling us about drugs. And it's like, where are you going somewhere with that? I was thinking, okay, maybe he's going at, okay, he takes so many pills a day, and, so his habits his addiction is very expensive, and so something, it never went anywhere. We just talked for a few minutes about how many pills he would take on any given day, and then they moved on. This whole trial has been a big waste of time, because even if this Murdaugh guy did kill his family, which I don't think he did, he had no motive and seemed pretty genuinely devastated, having to relive this through listening to the 911 tapes and having to talk about it, and on the video from the night of the murder, the interview, he seemed pretty devastated. And that's what you would expect of someone who had just seen their wife and their son blown to bits, his brain splattered on the ceiling. And so if you're going to try and argue that that person actually committed that terrible crime, you're going to need some pretty big evidence. You're going to need some kind of way to rationalize that. You're going to need to at least convince us that there was some kind of motive. If you don't have evidence that he actually did it, at least convince him that he has motive, which is, by the way, is not evidence. You still shouldn't convince someone because they had a motive to commit a crime, unless you can prove somehow that they did it. But at least that would be somewhat defensible, from a normie standpoint. Saying, okay, well, I understand why you think this Murdaugh guy, deserves to go to prison or, be executed for it. But that's just not the case here. 4 weeks the prosecution spent. Came up with nothing. A day and a half the prosecution has spent cross-examining Alex Murdaugh. This is a rare opportunity to get to cross-examine a defendant in a murder trial. Normally people are, not dumb enough to testify on their own behalf, because that typically doesn't end well. And apparently, I heard, according to NBC, there were 2 jurors who were bawling their eyes out, not during the direct examination when the defense was, having Murdaugh, present his side and go through, the events in a favorable environment. No, while he was being cross-examined by Richard Dreyfuss, not his real name, by the way, just a nickname, because he looks like him. During the cross-examination, that's when apparently these 2 jurors were crying their eyes out, apparently out of sympathy for Murdaugh, who I think he came across as more sympathetic today than yesterday. And so I think the best way to sum up today and every day of this trial that I've watched, which has not been, it's again, this is week 5. Most of the trial I had not seen. I just kept checking in, maybe one day a week until this week, which I've watched every day this week. But I would say the best way to sum up this trial is if you believe the prosecution, you don't have a brain. And if you don't believe Murdaugh, you don't have a heart. The whole, well, this guy's a crook, so he must have done it thing, it rings hollow with me. What doesn't ring hollow with me is watching a guy cry his eyes out talking about how he, found his youngest son with his brain splattered all over the wall. I've known frauds. I've even, been friendly, befriended people who I knew were frauds. I just didn't let them defraud me. Didn't let them get close to anything of value of mine. But they were otherwise, making nice people to be around. And they did a lot of bad things. I even, I've known some that have done a hard time for their fraud, for their theft, for their lies, and their taking advantage of the people around them. But believe it or not, not one of them is a murderer. Not one of them's ever killed anybody, and I don't think that any of them, these people that I've known, and it's not a huge sample size, obviously. I don't know, it's not like every guy on my block is a convicted fraudster. But of the frauds that I've known, they're not the types who would murder their whole family. And it's not that a fraudster is incapable of killing his family because he commits fraud. No, it's just these things are not connected. Just because you defraud people, just because you steal money, doesn't mean that you're a murderer. These are two very different lines that, to cross from a moral perspective. So anyway, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.